The Thorn made of steel, how barbed wire redrew the map of the American West. In the long inventory of things that have ended a way of life, few look as humble as a twist of wire with a spike in it. Gunpowder announces itself. The railroad thunders. But barbed wire simply sits there, silent, rusting gently, and yet within a single generation of its invention it closed the open range of the American West, ended the age of the free-roaming cowboy, redrew the economics of half a continent, and settled, in steel, one of the oldest questions in human history: where does my land end and yours begin? To understand why a spiked wire could do all that, you must first understand the problem of the Great Plains, and the problem was wood. East of the Mississippi, a farmer who wanted to keep cattle out of his corn had options as old as agriculture. He could split rails from his own timber, plant a hedge, or pile fieldstone. The prairie offered none of these. It was an ocean of grass, deep-soiled, fabulously fertile, and almost treeless. Hauling timber onto the plains cost more than the land it was meant to enclose. Smooth wire fences had been tried, and cattle, heavy, itchy, and profoundly indifferent, simply leaned into them until they sagged and gave way. The federal government could give land away under the Homestead Act, and did, but it could not give a homesteader any means of defending a wheat field from 1,000 longhorns. Without a cheap fence, the plains could be crossed and grazed, but never truly farmed. Settlements stalled at the timberline. The answer arrived, as answers often do, at a county fair. In 1873, at DeKalb, Illinois, a farmer named Henry Rose exhibited a curious contraption, a wooden rail studded with metal points, meant to hang on a wire and teach cattle to keep their distance. Among the visitors who paused at that stand were three men from DeKalb: a lumberman named Jacob Hayish, a hardware merchant named Isaac Elwood, and a 60-year-old farmer named Joseph Farwell Glidden. All three walked away thinking the same thought: the points were the right idea, but the wooden rail was absurd. Put the barbs on the wire itself. It was Glidden whose version conquered the world, and the reason is a beautiful lesson in what invention actually is. Anyone can put a spike on a wire, the problem is keeping it there. A barb that slides along the strand, or spins loose, is no barb at all. Glidden's insight worked out, the story goes, with the help of a converted coffee mill in his farmhouse kitchen, was to coil each short barb tightly around one wire, and then twist a second wire around the first, locking every barb in its place like a bead knotted into thread. Two strands, twisted, also solved a subtler problem: a single wire snaps as it expands and contracts with the seasons, but a double twist gives and takes without breaking. He filed his patent application in October 1873, and patent number 157,124 was granted on the 24th of November, 1874. Farmers came to call his design, with respect, the winner. What followed was one of the fastest transformations in agricultural history. Glidden sold a half interest in the patent to Elwood, the hardware man from the fair, and their barb fence company began turning out wire by the ton. The numbers tell the story with brutal economy. In 1874, a few thousand pounds of barbed wire were made. By 1880, 6 years later, production of Glidden-style wire had passed 80 million pounds a year. The price collapsed as production soared, until fencing an acre cost a fraction of any alternative. For the first time since humans had looked at the Great Plains, a poor family could afford to say, "This part is mine," and mean it. And here the story turns, because every fence has two sides. To the homesteader, barbed wire was liberation, the tool that made the Homestead Act finally work. To the open-range cattleman, it was strangulation. The entire economy of the great trail drives rested on the assumption that the grass and the water belonged, in practice, to whoever's herd was passing through. Now the trails began to close, one fence at a time. Cattle that had wandered freely piled up against wire in blizzards and died by the thousand. The tension broke into the fence-cutting wars of the early 1880s, when masked riders with wire cutters, with names like the Owls and the Blue Devils, went out at night to snip fences by the mile, and Texas made fence-cutting a felony to stop them. The wire won. It always won, because it was cheaper to replace than to cut. By the late 1880s, the open range was, for all practical purposes, over, not defeated by an army or a law, but enclosed by a hardware product. The legal war over who owned the idea was nearly as fierce as the range wars, and it ended in the grandest arena of all. Rivals, including Hayish, who had raced Glidden to the patent office, contested the patent for years, arguing that spiked fencing had been anticipated by earlier tinkerers. the dispute rose all the way to the United States Supreme Court, which in 1892 upheld Glidden's patent, reasoning that it was Glidden who had taken a floating idea and fixed it into a practical, manufacturable form, that the last small step which makes a thing finally work is precisely the step that deserves the name of invention. Glidden, the 60-year-old farmer from the county fair, died in 1906, one of the wealthiest men in America. There is a dinner-table irony hiding in all of this. We tend to imagine the West being won by the six-shooter and the railroad, the loud technologies. But ask what actually converted the ocean of grass into the checkerboard of farms you see from every aeroplane window today, and the answer is the quietest artifact imaginable, a twisted pair of wires, priced by the pound, sold out of a hardware store. The romantic, borderless west of the cattle drive lasted barely 20 years, roughly the gap between Glidden's patent and the Supreme Court's blessing of it. A landscape that had absorbed conquistadors, fur traders and cavalry without fundamentally changing its nature was remade in a single generation by a fence. The scale of what changed is easy to miss from inside a car window. In 1870, the region beyond the 100th meridian was, on the maps of the Land Office, an almost unbroken blank of public range. Within 25 years, essentially the whole of it lay behind wire, millions of miles of fence line, strung post by post across country where a wooden rail had once been worth its weight in bacon. Surveyors' abstractions, the township, the section, the quarter section, became things you could walk up to and touch. No purchase of territory, no war, and no railroad ever converted so much commons into so much property so quickly, and the instrument of the conversion cost a few cents a pound. The plains people who watched the wire advance gave it a name that has outlived every sales brochure: the Devil's Rope. In that phrase you can hear everything the fence meant to those on its losing side, the plains tribes, whose open hunting grounds the wire partitioned as decisively as any treaty, the trail bosses, whose northbound herds now zigzag between fenced sections, the smallholder in a drought year, watching fenced water he could not reach. Legend has credit for the wire's conquest of Texas going to a flamboyant young salesman named John Warren Gates, who was said to have penned wild longhorns inside a barbed wire corral in a San Antonio plaza and taken bets from doubting cattlemen that the fence would hold. It held, so the story goes, and the orders rolled in and the tale is likely embroidered, as the best sales stories are, but the sales figures it decorates were entirely real. And the wire was not finished rearranging the world when the frontier closed. Within a generation, the same cheap, portable, flesh-deterring thread had been taken up by armies, and the technology that fenced the Kansas wheat field went on to define the Western Front, where it entangled a continent's worth of young men between the trenches. It is one of history's bleaker rhymes. An implement invented to keep cattle out of corn became, almost unmodified, the signature obstacle of industrial war, and later the perimeter of every prison camp of the 20th century. Few artifacts have served the garden and the battlefield so impartially. The economists, meanwhile, learned their own lesson from the wire. Property rights, they observed, are not created by parchment and courthouse seals alone, they are created by whatever makes a boundary cheap to enforce. For the cost of a spool of wire, the abstract line on a land office map became a physical fact that a 2,000-pound animal would respect. Historians of the American economy rank the humble barb, pound for pound, among the most consequential inventions of its century, not because it was clever, but because it was cheap enough to be everywhere. So the next time you pass a rusting strand of barbed wire on a country walk and somewhere near you, there is one, look closely at the little coiled barb. That twist of steel is a property deed made physical, the cheapest border ever manufactured, and the small hinge on which the whole modern map of the American countryside quietly swung shut.